Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for turning out. On behalf of the International Relations Department and the Political Science Department, who are jointly sponsoring this event, we are very honored to invite Professor Stephen M. Walt, one of the foremost international relations scholars in the world, to offer his thoughts on the future of the U.S. in the world at this critical moment in history. In the early hours of November 6th, it became clear that, despite projections that it would be a very tight race that might take days to call, Donald J. Trump had done the impossible. He overcame his 2020 election loss, 2 impeachments, including one for inciting an insurrection in January 2021, charges of election tampering and business fraud in the state of New York. In the end, he was found guilty of sexual abuse, as well as 34 felony counts of falsifying business records to pay hush money to a porn star, becoming the second person in U.S. history to win non-consecutive terms in the White House. On the campaign trail, Trump promised sweeping changes to NATO, the future of Ukraine, relations with Mexico, purges of the civil service, radical cuts to the federal budget, deportations of as many as 11 million undocumented workers, and vindication against critics and the Democratic Party. In the weeks since he won re-election, he has announced appointments of at least a dozen unqualified marginal figures, including theocrats and conspiracy theorists, to key positions of U.S. foreign policy. This includes Fox News personality Pete Hegseth as Secretary of Defense, former GOP Representative Tulsi Gabbard as DIA Director, former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee as U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Kristi Noem as Secretary of Homeland Security, and 2020 election truther, GOP Representative Elise Stefanik as U.S. Ambassador to the UN. All of this occurs in the backdrop of long-standing debates over the future of U.S. global leadership. Many foreign policy experts believe that the U.S. power is declining rapidly and that this trend will have dangerous, destabilizing effects on world politics. Professor Walt believes that reports of U.S. decline have been exaggerated, and it is likely to remain the world's most powerful state for many years to come. Furthermore, he argues that a modest decline in American power is not something to fear. It may even lead to a more stable and tranquil world order. Stephen M. Walt is a Robert and Renée Belfer Professor of International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He's a columnist at Foreign Policy magazine and a member of the board of directors of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Professor Walt was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in May 2005 and received the International Studies Association Distinguished Senior Scholar Award in 2014. His books include The Origins of Alliances from 1987, which received the 1988 Edgar S. Furness National Security Book Award, Taming American Power, The Global Response to U.S. Primacy in 2005, which was a finalist for the Lionel Gelber International Affairs book, and the award, and the Arthur Ross Book Prize, and, together with John J. Mearsheimer, the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy in 2007, which became a New York Times bestseller translated into more than 20 languages. His latest book is The Hell of Good Intentions, America's Foreign Policy Elite and the Decline of U.S. Primacy in 2008. Please join me in welcoming Professor Stephen Walt.
I'm going to stand up over here to deliver this. So it is a pleasure to be back here at CEU today, although the subject of my talk is not a happy one. I'm going to talk about America's position in the world and whether it's declining, and that forces me to talk about where the United States is going to go in a second Trump administration. As I will make clear in a moment, the United States is still an immensely powerful country, so what it chooses to do, or what it chooses not to do, inevitably has enormous effects on everyone else in the world. We are all, in a sense, about to participate in a giant social science experiment with no human subject controls, and there's every reason to believe that the experiment is going to be harmful to many. So I want to talk about 3 big topics. First, what is, in fact, America's position in the world today? Is the United States in decline? Was Trump right to say that it was time to make America great again? I'm going to explain why I think this is not the case, and even why a modest decline in American power might not be such a bad thing. Second, I'm going to offer some thoughts on why Trump won, because they may tell you a lot about where we're likely to go in the future. And then finally, I'm going to offer some specific predictions about what Trump is likely to do in foreign policy and what that means for the rest of the world. And the spoiler alert here is that I don't see very many reasons to be optimistic, and I see many reasons to be worried. So let me start with the first question. Is the United States in decline? The fear of American decline is a hardy perennial. It has been around for decades in the United States. In the 1950s, after the launch of Sputnik, Americans thought that the Soviet Union was running past us. During the Vietnam War, Nixon and Kissinger worried that the United States was becoming what Nixon called a pitiful, helpless giant, and this would have horrible consequences for the rest of the world. In the 1980s, historian Paul Kennedy became wealthy with his book, Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, which saw the United States succumbing to imperial overstretch. And he predicted, by the way, what the next number one power was going to be? Japan. Not so much. Today, however, China's rise and the shift of power towards Asia and political problems in the United States have led many to conclude that, okay, the Cassandras are finally right. I have long thought this view was mistaken, though Trump may make it come true. All right, so power in world politics is always relative. States are either stronger than weaker than others. It's always shifting constantly. Even so, the United States is still in remarkably good shape by almost any measure. First of all, it's always important to consider what your baseline is. If you pick a year like 1945 or a year like 1992, then American decline looks inevitable because those were unusual moments where other powers had dropped by the wayside for one reason or another. Once they began to recover, America's relative share of world power was destined to shrink. Today, the American economy is still the world's largest in nominal terms, and our per capita income is about 7 times that of China. This matters because per capita income tells you about the surplus wealth that's available that can be directed to various purposes. The American economy has been growing more rapidly than any of the other major industrial democracies. The dollar remains the world's principal reserve currency, and that's not going to change for a long time. And America's position in the global financial architecture gives it enormous power to, for example, impose economic sanctions on countries we happen to be mad at. American firms are still highly innovative. Our higher education system is still unmatched, despite my best efforts. And American cultural institutions still cast a very large shadow over much of the world. The United States also has comparatively favorable democracy. The United States is still growing in population, unlike much of Asia and much of Europe now. And in fact, the American population is somewhat younger on average than most of these countries. And then finally, there's the military advantages. We spend about twice as much as China does on defense every year. We have this vast global network of bases, alliances with a number of other important countries. When you step back and look at it, no other country could contemplate invading, conquering, blockading, or coercing the United States to any significant extent. It's really an extraordinary position. And then last but not least, there's geography. The United States is the only major power in the Western Hemisphere. And when, again, you step back and look at history, every other major power today has been either attacked or invaded at some time in the last 200 years. The last time the continental United States was invaded was the War of 1812, a war we foolishly started, and that got the United States invaded and the White House burned down. My apologies to Canada, we will never do it again. All right, but since then, the United States has been largely free. Every other country, even Great Britain, suffered roughly 50,000 deaths at home during World War II. the United States has been in an extraordinary favorable position, and that gives American leaders extraordinary latitude to decide just how involved they want to be in the world. Other states often want our help, but when things don't go well, we can always cut our losses and come home, as we've done on a number of occasions. There is one, however, black cloud in this large silver lining, and that's, of course, the fragile condition of American political institutions, which may cause it to squander all of those advantages. And I'll say more about that in a moment. Now, might a modest decline in American primacy, American dominance, in fact be a good thing? This sounds unlikely, particularly if you're in the United States, but I'm not so sure. Even if the United States were somewhat weaker than it is today, the only existential threat that Americans would face would be a nuclear war, catastrophic climate change, the arrival of a pathogen as contagious and more lethal than COVID-19. Although the foreign policy establishment in the United States thinks otherwise, the United States does not, in fact, need to dominate other parts of the world in order to be safe and prosperous. At most, it needs to help ensure that hostile powers do not dominate those regions and that global institutions work reasonably well. Those who still see the United States as the indispensable power assume, of course, that it will use that power wisely and effectively, but that hasn't been the case in recent years. And to get ahead of myself just a bit, it's those recurring foreign policy failures, including under President Biden, that provide one of the reasons that Donald Trump won the last election. So just to spell this out in a bit more detail, American Middle East policy has been a train wreck for 30 years or so. We failed to bring Middle East peace through the Oslo peace process. We suffered an attack from the Middle East on September 11th. That led to the global war on terror and to failed interventions in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, and most recently, of course, Gaza. And none of the parties responsible for those policies was ever held accountable. Now, the United States may not be solely responsible for all of the problems of that region, but our fingerprints are on a lot of them. Open-ended NATO expansion did not, in fact, create a vast zone of peace in Europe, as was promised. On the contrary, it poisoned relations with Russia, drove Russia and China closer together, and eventually led Moscow to seize Crimea and then illegally invade the rest of Ukraine in 2022. Europe is less secure today, and US policy is part of the reason. Now again, the United States is not solely responsible for all of this. Vladimir Putin bears his share of the blame too, but the United States and its actions are not blameless either. The financial crisis of 2008 and the consequences of hyper-globalization cast doubt on American judgment, discredited the neoliberal model that the United States had been promoting, and fueled populism on both sides of the Atlantic. And then finally, the broader effort to create a global liberal order, which you might call liberal hegemony, has largely failed. Democracy has been in retreat worldwide for nearly 20 years, and of course is now under siege in the United States itself. What I want to suggest is that all these results are the predictable consequence of unchecked power. Because the United States was so strong, wealthy, and secure, leaders in both parties, Republicans and Democrats alike, were free to indulge some unrealistic fantasies and make the same mistakes over and over again, paying no consequences for any of them. Instead, it was other people in the United States or people in other countries that bore the price of these failures. In theory, at least, an end to unchecked American primacy would force US leaders to set clearer priorities and abandon the effort to shape local politics in every corner of the world. It would also encourage states that repeatedly engage in reckless behavior because they think Uncle Sam will bail them out if they get in trouble, to act with greater prudence. In short, A rational and prudent adjustment in American policies that had repeatedly failed might leave both the United States and the rest of the world better off. But a rational and prudent adjustment is not what we are likely to get from Donald Trump. And if that's the case, how ever did he get elected? So let me turn to my second question. Why did Trump win? There are many reasons, I think, why he won re-election despite his terrible record and everything that Erin recounted. And of course, in the United States and elsewhere, commentators have been working overtime to try and figure this out. If it wasn't clear already, I think it is now obvious that the conventional wisdom about how U.S. elections work is just dead wrong. Polls and pollsters were off again. Truisms about the importance of the ground game or the key role that money would play in determining the outcome didn't seem to work this time around. All the smart people who thought they knew what was going to happen were not just wrong, but off by a lot. And as in 2016, the Trump campaign may have been as surprised by the outcome as the rest of us. So there's already lots of expert opinion explaining what went wrong for Democrats. And why the results were not what most people predicted. But remember, these are the same experts who've had 8 years to figure out what's going on and have muffed it again. Here's what I think is going on, but I hasten to add I'm no smarter than anybody else. First point, American elites, and especially Democrats, are still underestimating how much white-hot anger there is out there in the body politic directed at them. Trump hates those ruling elites just as much as many Americans do, because those elites never respected or embraced him. And many voters believe he gets them and respects them and sees things as they do. Trump is convincing and sincere because his hatred of them is genuine. It may be the only genuine thing about him, and that comes across. Second, Biden had some genuine achievements, but he never got credit for them, and he did a terrible job of selling them. His team had managed the American economy quite well, and they kept assuming Americans would reward them for bringing inflation down, achieving full employment, and Americans didn't. And part of the problem was Biden was simply too old to get out on the road and on TV and remind people of what he'd achieved. But there were also some items, such as housing costs, that remained stubbornly high, so people didn't feel that much better off. Another reason the Democrats didn't understand this was Biden's decision to run again, right, until the last minute. So there was no genuine primary contest. Primaries let a party figure out which candidate is most appealing to voters, provides lots of feedback about what the public is thinking. The Democrats didn't have the advantage of any of that, so they never were able to craft a message that spoke to what voters really wanted. Trump never faced a serious primary challenger, but he did win a bunch of them, and all those rallies gave him both free publicity and helped him figure out what the big applause lines were. What were the things that people wanted to hear? Fourth, Harris ran a decent campaign, especially given her late start, but she never distanced herself from Biden, who was increasingly unpopular, or said what she would do differently than what he had done. Among other things, if she had parted company with him on some key issues, such as Gaza, it would have made her look like a real leader with an independent position and an independent agenda, and not just another sleek Democratic Party politician in a nice suit. She didn't have a lot of time to define herself in the minds of voters, and frankly didn't work that hard to do so. And as some people here know well, if you don't define yourself, your opponents will be all too happy to do it for you. And of course, that's exactly what the Trump campaign did. Even worse, Kamala Harris was, for some Americans, their worst nightmare. Back in 2020, Joe Biden was reassuring. He was an old white guy who was much nicer than Trump was and who understood working class America. Harris was a woman of color, a lawyer with a rich husband, no kids. She was exactly the sort of person Trump said was trying to take over the country and change it in all sorts of ways. And I am sorry to say that a lot of my fellow citizens understood that and believed that message. The same thing that made Harris appealing to liberals in the Democratic Party made her scary to a lot of others. Finally, polls both before and after the election show that many voters opposed the foreign policy agenda that Harris and Biden represented. Gaza was part of that, but also Ukraine, and in particular, Biden's insistence that the United States should keep trying to run the world. Having neoconservatives like Liz Cheney endorse Harris was a mistake because the country had rejected their agenda a long time ago. Now, just one final comment about the election. The one Democrat who had the right formula and has had it for a long time was, of course, Bernie Sanders. He wanted to get the United States out of the war business and use that money to help Americans back home. But the rest of the Democratic Party had rejected Sanders a long time ago and rejected his message. And we've now seen the results not once, but twice. So what's going to happen now? Well, if you're a movie fan, you know that sequels are rarely as good as the original. And they often take a much darker turn. That's likely to be the case with Trump's second term as well. So I'm going to give you 10 predictions about what I think is going to happen. And the first, of course, is that Trump will be unpredictable. He sees it as an asset that keeps others off balance. So he doesn't read memos, he doesn't listen to staff advice, he doesn't operate in a systematic and organized way. He said a lot of crazy stuff in the campaign, but how much of that was bluster, how much of that is very sincere remains to be seen. His initial foreign policy appointments are very hardline on China, very pro-Israel, but they're also almost entirely weak and pliable loyalists who have no independent power base of their own, who are unlikely to stand up to Trump, and who will be very easy to blame and fire if things go wrong. Because Trump is never wrong, someone else always has to be there to take the fall. It would be very interesting to wonder if there's a betting line already on which is the first appointee to get fired down the road and how long that will take. It's also, I think, unclear how much attention he's even going to devote to foreign affairs. Will he focus primarily on enacting revenge on his Democratic rivals, pursuing a radical agenda at home, or will he try to also transform American policy all over the world? No one knows. And there are some deep contradictions in his foreign policy program, which I'll get to. We don't know how he'll resolve them either. The bottom line is nobody should be too confident that they know what Trump will do, including me. All right, second, liberal hegemony is dead. This idea that the United States was going to use its power to create a global liberal order, promoting democracy, open markets, human rights, institutions, etc. That's dead. Joe Biden, Anthony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Kamala Harris, and the rest of their team tried to revive and tweak that strategy, the same strategy that had basically guided American foreign policy since the end of the Cold War, with the exception of Trump's first term. And their attempt was no more successful than the earlier versions. I think the voters have now delivered a pretty decisive rejection. Trump is not interested in spreading democracy, doesn't care at all about human rights, is skeptical of free trade, wants to keep foreigners out of the country, maybe remove some, and opposes most global institutions. I think we are witnessing the end of a long era of American global leadership and the beginning of a new era of rather selfish realpolitik, not just in the United States, but that will be imitated elsewhere. Number 3, beware the coming trade war. Maybe Trump's campaign talk about imposing 1930s era tariffs on everyone was just bluster, and more sensible people will talk him out of this down the road. It may depend on whether he listens to die-hard protectionists like Robert Lighthizer, likely to be trade representative, or to his new tech bro pals who depend on relatively open markets and global supply chains. If he does start a serious trade war, he'll face rising deficits, bond market pressures, inflation, and a bunch of other problems, and the whole world will get a lot poorer. But again, we don't know exactly how he'll play that. Number 4, this one I'm actually pretty confident of. Europe is in trouble. Trump does not see America's European allies as a strategic asset, and he's openly hostile to the European Union. He declared it a rival, and I think even an enemy, during his first term. He supported Brexit, for example, because he understood that a European Union that could speak with one voice on economic issues was harder for the United States to deal with. It was a more even competition. The Republican Party is dead set against most forms of regulation, and people like Elon Musk and others oppose Europe's more stringent rules on digital privacy. So Trump is going to ignore Brussels almost entirely and focus on bilateral relations with independent or separate European states, where the United States, because it's so much bigger, is in a much stronger position. He will do whatever he can, in my view, to weaken or divide Europe further. In theory, that danger could lead Europeans to unite in opposition, as French President Emmanuel Macron keeps advocating, but I think every nation for itself is the more likely response here, if history is any guide. Now, as for NATO, Trump may decide to opt out entirely, although NATO is still popular with most Americans. It ranks pretty well in public opinion polls, and a formal withdrawal, leaving the alliance entirely, would face a lot of pushback from some Republicans and almost certainly from the Pentagon. It's more likely, in my view, that he'll choose to remain inside the alliance while continually berating Europeans for not doing more on defense, and in particular, pushing them to spend those extra defense dollars on American weapons. He doesn't want to see Europe develop a lot of powerful, advanced, sophisticated defense industries that will then compete with Lockheed Martin and Boeing on world markets. He would like Poland, Germany, France to spend as much of that money in the United States as possible, and the temptation to do that, to appease him and keep the United States in the alliance, may be very hard for Europe to resist. Bottom line here is the Biden years were something of a warm bath for NATO. Trump, too, will feel like a cold shower. So that was number 4, Europe's in trouble. Number 5, Ukraine is in real trouble. I believe Harris would have pushed hard for a peace deal, for an end to the fighting in Ukraine, had she been elected. And the best possible deal that I can see would still have been quite unfavorable for Kyiv. But she would have tried to use the prospect of continued American support to get them somewhat better terms, and would have provided security assistance after the deal was struck. Trump is much more likely to simply cut off American support and tell Europe that Ukraine is their problem. It's right next door to you guys. You deal with it if you care so much about it. The new Congress is unlikely to vote a big new aid package. Remember, Biden had trouble getting the last one through, even though Democrats controlled the House of Representatives. And Trump's only concern might be that if he cuts off Ukraine, Russia will overrun the rest of the country and make him look feckless, weak, or naive. But if Putin doesn't want all of Ukraine, accepts a permanent division, and what's left is a damaged Ukraine that is nominally independent but never likely to join NATO, most Americans are going to turn the page and move on. Trump will then take full credit for ending the war, and he will call the Norwegians and demand that they give him the Nobel Peace Prize. Number 6, Middle East strife will continue. Biden and Blinken's mishandling of the Middle East hurt Harris in the election, but matters are not going to improve with Trump in the White House. He will shed not a single tear for the tragic losses that innocent people in Gaza, Lebanon, and the occupied West Bank have endured. His appointees are likely to resume maximum pressure on Iran, and Israel will have a green light to annex the West Bank and either abuse, expel, or eradicate the Palestinians there. He will definitely try to avoid sending U.S. troops to the Middle East and have them engaged in any kind of serious combat role, because he understands that's unpopular at home. But I would not rule out using air power to destroy Iran's nuclear infrastructure, unless his pal Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia tells him that that's not a particularly good idea. Now, it could even get weirder than that. You could imagine Trump casting himself as a grand peacemaker and pursuing some kind of great bargain along the lines of the failed Abraham Accords. I could even imagine him announcing that he'd be happy to meet with Iranian President Pezeshkian or even Supreme Leader Khamenei, the same way he met with Kim Jong-un during his first term. But because Trump has neither the patience nor the bandwidth to conduct a real negotiation, again, he doesn't care about details, nothing is likely to come from any of that. Number 7, what about China? As I said earlier, Trump's advisors don't fully agree on how to handle China. He will almost certainly play hardball on trade issues. I find it hard to believe he would roll back the restriction on chips and other forms of technology transfer to Chinese firms. Hostility to China is, in fact, about the one bipartisan issue left in Washington, and that makes some kind of grand bargain between Washington and Beijing very hard to imagine at this point. As I said a while back, his initial appointees are uniformly very hardline on China as well. Unfortunately, Trump is also likely to pick fights with America's Asian allies. And he's already sowed doubts about whether he would come to Taiwan's support if it were directly threatened or attacked. Because standing up to China in Asia depends on partners there for the simple and obvious reason that the United States is an ocean away. Trump's approach contains a deep inner contradiction, right? You can't really stand up to China if you don't have good and close relations with our partners in Asia, but he's going to pick fights with them on trade and other things as well. Chinese officials are probably somewhat ambivalent about Trump's reelection. They are clearly worried about facing stiff new tariffs, but they also know that Trump's an incompetent manager whose approach to Asia during the first term was incoherent and ineffective. A second Trump presidency will probably reverse some of the gains that Biden and Blinken made in Asia. It's probably their biggest foreign policy achievement, and that's, of course, a development that Beijing will welcome. Greater turmoil and divisions within the United States is probably something else that would gratify Xi Jinping as well. Number 8, climate change. Trump refuses to take climate change seriously and believes the right energy policy is, as he said in the campaign, drill, baby, drill. He isn't concerned about the consequences because, of course, he'll be safely dead before Mar-a-Lago is underwater. Global progress on climate change will slow. The green transition in the United States will be reversed. Global efforts to secure humanity's future will stall. This approach may, in fact, also cede the high ground of green technologies to China and weaken America's long-term economic position. But again, Trump will be dead by then and is unlikely to care. Number 9. I'll call this, does he have unified power within a divided society? Republicans are now saying, you can find this all over, that Trump's victory is in fact a sign of national unity, not division. Most Americans have rallied around the former president. This view is seriously misleading. More than half the country voted for someone else. He did not get 50% of the vote. Democrats are not going to embrace the MAGA agenda, especially at home, and the measures outlined in Project 2025, if you've ever taken a look at them, are going to show much greater divisions within the body politic. Going after his political opponents, gaining the ability to fire civil servants and military officers he doesn't like, making safe abortion impossible even in states where it's legal, deporting millions, and attacking universities and other vital institutions of civil society is not going to unify the country. At the same time, though, the Republican Party's long game, their long-term campaign to create a more unified executive, is now much closer to fruition, with control of the White House, Senate, House of Representatives in Republican hands, and with a tame Supreme Court. The problem with unified and unchecked power, however, is that it's hard to detect mistakes and correct them in time. Mechanisms of accountability are already weaker than they should be in the United States, and Trump is going to undermine them further. Now, apart from the domestic consequences for, say, public health, safety, women's rights, central bank autonomy, deepening polarization, an increasingly divided society, even with a strong executive, also threatens America's ability to conduct an effective foreign policy. When the pendulum keeps swinging wildly with each election, no other country can count on the United States to do anything it has promised to do for longer than a single term. When the government is preoccupied with rooting out domestic enemies, deporting millions of residents, and replacing experienced public servants with loyalists and hacks, its ability to conduct a sensible approach to the outside world inevitably declines. Again, a deeply divided America is precisely what American adversaries would want to see, and there's no reason to think that Trump will do anything but make that problem worse. Number 10, I want to end on an optimistic note. That's not easy. But I do see one very slim ray of hope. Leaders with unchecked power are prone to overreach, and backlash can be swift and quite fierce. Lyndon Johnson won an enormous landslide, far greater than Trump's landslide, in 1964, and he was so unpopular 4 years later he chose not to run for re-election. All right, Richard Nixon achieved again a sweeping victory over George McGovern in 1972 and was brought down by Watergate 2 years later. Boris Johnson won the largest parliamentary majority in decades in Great Britain a few years ago, and he was out of office shortly thereafter. And there are some early signs, if you look at those early appointments and some of the things Trump has said, that he may be doing exactly the same thing, that he sees the election as a vindication that he is, in fact, a very stable genius who doesn't have to listen to advice and can basically try to do whatever he wants. But if things go badly, and that happens soon enough, many of the people who voted for him are going to be hurt, and some of them are going to regret their decision and start looking for an alternative. That's what happened in his first term, and if he hasn't already rigged the election system, which Republicans will undoubtedly try to do, then his worst excesses may be curbed. Buyer's remorse will come back to haunt him. So that's my one piece of optimism. I'm sorry I can't offer anything more reassuring. To be clear, I don't think everything Trump and the Republicans are going to do will be harmful, but whatever modest gains they make by some smart policies, I think are likely to be swamped by a series of self-inflicted wounds, and Americans are going to wake up and discover that their fears of decline have finally come to fruition, almost entirely due to bad political decisions at home. So to sum this all up in a sentence, it is late November 2024. Winter is coming. Thanks for listening. I look forward to hearing what Erin has to say and to hearing your questions and comments. Thanks.